So critical media literacy is really, more than anything, an attempt to reframe our understandings of literacy. It's about recognizing that in the 21st century, to be able to read and write requires much more than what was necessary back, 500 years ago or even 10 years ago. And so the two goals of critical media literacy really are: one, expanding our understanding of literacy to include more forms of information communication, from advertising to pictures to movies to podcasts, all of these. So when we talk about literacy, we're no longer just talking about being able to read letters on a page, so that we're moving beyond the old notions of print literacy to this more multimodal idea that all the different ways we communicate are literacy. And we need to be able to read and make sense of this information. We need to be able to create with this information. So on one level is this kind of horizontal expansion of literacy to include every way we communicate. The other idea is kind of this vertical deepening of education to recognize that information and power are always connected. And so looking at the ways that information influences, shapes, is shaped by, and perpetuates ideas and thinking is really key, because some people still kind of hold on to the old notions that information is neutral, that media are objective. And it's really important to move beyond that, to recognize that everything has a bias because everything's created by human beings, and just having a bias isn't bad, but we need to interrogate and ask questions about those biases and about the construction of our information. Well, reading and writing is enough, but reading and writing just letters on a page is not enough. So what we need to expand is our idea of what it means to read and write. Because if we're talking about the idea of being literate in the world, being able to understand and make sense of information and being able to communicate, well, we have to be able to do that with more than just letters and print, because that's how the majority of people get their information. Social media, movies, TV, video games, all these things are forms of communication that all the same rules of literacy apply to, but it's much more than just that book and those letters on the page. Sure. And it's very attractive. I mean, the cell phones give you access to everything, anyone in the world. I mean, it's an amazing power. They're mini computers. So we can't compete with them. And so if we can't compete with them, we can't beat them, then we need to figure out how can we best engage with them. And one thing we need to do is help students think more critically about them, getting them to ask more critical thinking questions, about the engagement they're already doing with these tools. The other thing is to help them think and find ways to be able to use these tools for positive purposes, for learning the academic content they're learning, or even better, for being able to communicate and contribute to society in responsible ways. And so I think one of the things we need to do is not fear and not try to censor against these tools, these electronic
games.
Yeah, sure. Some of them definitely are games, and so it's not about having a fighting relationship. We don't want to be antagonistic with them. We want to be critical with them, and we want to engage with them. We want to co-opt them instead of allowing them to co-opt us.
Can you define critical?
So the term critical is defined and used by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. Some people use critical just simply to say, they're doing something a little bit more than they would otherwise. There are a lot of people who say critical thinking is just kind of the ability to, understand a passage that you're reading. The approach that I take to critical, when I'm talking about critical media literacy, comes from years of research in terms of critical theory. And critical theorists equate critical with an analysis of power. And that's really kind of the key component of critical, is that it's an interrogation of power and hierarchies of power. And so when we're talking about critical media literacy, we're asking questions about who's controlling the messages, who's influencing, who has the power, and who doesn't. So one of the big questions we ask is who's benefiting from this message and who's not, who's losing out or being hurt by this message. Getting at the big idea that messages are not neutral, that there's always an element of power in play.
But what do you think a teacher could do right now to implement critical media literacy in their classroom?
Well, I think there's a lot of things. One of them is, like I was saying before, is try to change their thoughts about literacy. Recognize, one, that literacy is much more inclusive than just print. So when they're teaching whatever it is, bringing in videos, bringing in music, bringing in all the different art forms and the different ways we communicate, so that the students are learning about whatever the content is through different mediums, and also having the students respond to this, not by only either taking a test or writing an essay, but also by having them create different types of media, like a podcast like this, having them create videos, digital stories, memes, TikTok videos. I mean, there's so many different ways for communicating. So increasing that, if teachers can do that. But then the other key part that we've been talking about in terms of critical is getting them to ask these questions. You know, in the newer book that I have, we list 6 questions, and basically having the students ask, well, who created this? How did they create it? How could different people think about it? What are different values or ideologies that are embedded in the message or that are missing from the message? Asking about motivation. Why do you think this was created? And then ultimately, my favorite question is asking, well, who's benefiting from this and who's being harmed by this? Getting them to recognize that information is not just neutral, that there are always people that are either benefiting or being hurt by almost anything that we hear or see. Because all our ideas come through representations.
Okay.
You know, there's very little we actually experience firsthand ourselves. Almost all our information about other people, about other places, comes through media, through either stories we hear, we see, television shows. And so it's really important that we critique and question those messages that are coming in, because it's not just the content, but also the way the message is put together that ends up putting us in a certain position to think about that message. So if we're watching, you know, something about the COVID vaccine, the vaccines that are coming out, whoever's telling us that information, it's probably through something we're reading or hearing or watching on some multimedia format. That's being shaped, the way it's being filmed, the way what's being edited and shared with us, and not who's speaking, who's not speaking. All of those are informing and constructing our ideas about that vaccine.